The taste of defeat. When ice cream ended a war. In the sweltering heat of a Pacific island in 1945, a starving Japanese lieutenant tasted vanilla ice cream for the first time and understood with crushing clarity that his nation's sacrifice had been for nothing. This is the story of how America's industrial might, symbolized by a certain ship built solely to produce frozen desserts, delivered a psychological blow more devastating than any bomb. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka had survived months of starvation, watching his comrades die not from bullets, but from hunger. He had been taught that American soldiers were barbaric devils who would torture prisoners without mercy. But when he finally surrendered expecting execution, he instead received medical care, clean water, and kindness. Then Sergeant Miller showed him something that would haunt him forever: the USS Quartz, a massive certain vessel anchored in the bay, producing 10 gallons of ice cream every single minute for American troops. In that moment, Hiroshi realized the terrible truth. Japan had been fighting an enemy so overwhelmingly superior that the war had been lost before it even began. This is the story of how a simple frozen dessert became the most powerful weapon in the Pacific. August 7th, 1945. Guadalcanal, 1400 hours. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his cheek against the volcanic rock, feeling its heat radiate through his hollow cheeks. 3 days without food. 8 days without rice. 42 days since his unit had received any supply drop whatsoever. The jungle buzzed with insects that had grown fat on the corpses of his men who had died not from American bullets, but from starvation, from dysentery, from fevers that turned their skin yellow and their minds to vapor. He could hear the Americans now. Their boots, actual boots, not the worn-through canvas wrappings that passed for footwear in the Imperial Japanese Army, crunched through the underbrush with the confidence of men who had never known hunger. Their voices carried easily through the thick air, casual, almost bored. One of them was laughing. Hiroshi closed his eyes. In his mind, he recited the words he had memorized from the manual distributed to all Japanese soldiers facing capture. The enemy is barbarous. They will torture you. They will mutilate you. They will parade your shame before your ancestors. Death is preferable. Death is honorable. Death is the only path. But his body had already made a different calculation. His body, that traitor, had already chosen survival. When he raised his hands above his head and stood, his knees buckled. The Americans' weapons swung toward him with mechanical precision, but no one fired. He waited for the bullets, for the bayonets, for the beginning of the torture he had been promised. Instead, a voice, young, tired, speaking English he barely understood, said, "Jesus, look at him. Kid's a skeleton." The American who approached him moved without urgency. Sergeant John Miller, Hiroshi would later learn, from a place called Ohio, though at that moment he was simply a large man in a clean uniform, smelling impossibly of soap. Miller held a canteen in one hand, his rifle slung casually across his back, as if he had never considered for a moment that this walking corpse might pose a threat. "Easy," Miller said, unscrewing the canteen cap. "Water. Drink slow." Hiroshi understood the word water. His hand shook so violently that Miller had to guide the canteen to his lips, holding it steady the way one might for a child. The water was cool. Not cold, but cool enough that it seemed to have come from another world entirely. It tasted of metal and minerals and something else, chlorine perhaps, some chemical treatment that spoke of infrastructure and logistics, and a supply chain that extended across an ocean to ensure that even here, on this forgotten island, American soldiers drank purified water. He drank until Miller pulled the canteen away. "That's enough for now. You'll make yourself sick." 2 more soldiers appeared carrying a stretcher. They lowered Hiroshi onto it with surprising gentleness, their movements practiced, efficient. One of them examined his legs, covered in tropical ulcers that had eaten through skin and muscle to the bone in places. The soldier made a sound of disgust, but it was directed at the wounds, not at Hiroshi himself. "Poor bastard," the soldier muttered. "These aren't even combat injuries. This is just neglect." As they carried him through the jungle, Hiroshi kept waiting for the violence to begin. Surely this kindness was a prelude, a way to lower his guard before the Americans revealed their true nature. The propaganda had been very specific. Capture meant degradation, torture, a death without honor. His own officers had told stories of American soldiers who collected gold teeth from living prisoners, who committed atrocities too horrible to speak aloud. But the stretcher bearers just walked, their breathing steady, occasionally swatting at mosquitoes or adjusting their grip. One of them offered him more water. Another draped a poncho over his body to shield him from the sun that filtered through the jungle canopy. When they emerged from the tree line, Hiroshi saw the American camp for the first time, and something inside him began to crack. The camp stretched across the coastal plain like a small city. Not tents, though there were tents, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect geometric rows, but something more. There were buildings, wooden structures with actual walls and roofs. He could see trucks, dozens of them parked in neat lines. A bulldozer worked in the distance, its engine growling as it carved a road through the earth. Men moved everywhere with purpose, but without panic, their uniforms clean, their faces showing mere weariness rather than the hollow-eyed desperation that had become the default expression in the Imperial Japanese Army. But it was the smell that truly disoriented him. Food. Not the smell of individual meals being cooked over open fires, but the industrial smell of mass feeding, of kitchens operating on a scale he could barely comprehend. Bread, meat, coffee. Scents that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one he had been inhabiting, where men boiled their leather boots to extract what little nutrition the hide might offer. They carried him to a medical tent. No, a medical building, he realized, constructed from lumber and equipped with electric lights powered by a generator that hummed somewhere nearby. A doctor approached, a man in his 40s with gray hair and glasses that caught the light. He looked at Hiroshi, not with hatred, not with contempt, but with the clinical concern of a professional confronting a difficult case. "How long since he's eaten?" the doctor asked. He didn't say, probably can't talk much. The doctor lifted Hiroshi's eyelids, shone a light in his eyes, pressed fingers against his neck to check his pulse. Severe malnutrition, advanced beriberi. Those leg ulcers are infected. Get an IV started. Saline and glucose first. We'll introduce solid food gradually. Hiroshi understood perhaps one word in 5, but he understood the tone. This was not the voice of a man preparing to torture a prisoner. This was not even the voice of a man who particularly cared that Hiroshi was an enemy. This was the voice of a man solving a medical problem, no different than if Hiroshi had been an American soldier or a piece of machinery that needed repair. They hooked him to tubes and bottles. The glucose entering his bloodstream felt like fire and ice simultaneously, his body so depleted that even this basic intervention seemed miraculous. A nurse, a woman, incredibly, an American woman working just behind the front lines, changed the dressings on his legs, her touch impersonal but not rough. "You're going to be okay," she said, though Hiroshi didn't understand the words. "You're safe now." Safe. The word would have been incomprehensible even if he had spoken English. How could he be safe? He was a prisoner of war, captured by an enemy his own propaganda had portrayed as devils incarnate. And yet, looking around the medical facility at the rows of beds, some occupied by Americans, some by other Japanese prisoners, all receiving the same care, he could not make the reality before him match the lies he had been told. 3 days later, his strength marginally returned. Hiroshi was moved to the prisoner compound. It was not what he expected. Yes, there was a barbed wire fence. Yes, there were guards with rifles. But the prisoners inside moved freely, sat in small groups talking, some even reading books provided by their captors. No one was being beaten. No one was being tortured. Men played cards. Others slept in the shade of palm trees that had been deliberately left standing within the compound perimeter. Sergeant Miller found him on the fourth day, carrying a clipboard and accompanied by a Japanese-American translator, a young man named Private Henry Takahashi, who spoke with a strange accent. Japanese words filtered through an American sensibility. "The sergeant wants to know if you're feeling better," Takahashi translated. Hiroshi nodded, not trusting his voice. Miller smiled, the expression tired but genuine. "Good. Listen, we're not going to interrogate you. You're a lieutenant, not a general. You don't know anything we need to know. But I wanted to show you something. Call it educational." They walked out of the compound, walked, not marched, with Miller and Takahashi as escorts, but not as guards. Other prisoners watched them go with curiosity, but not alarm. This, too, was jarring. The casualness of it all, the absence of violence lurking just beneath the surface. Miller led them to a cliff overlooking the bay. The Pacific stretched out before them, impossibly blue, and anchored in that blue were ships. Dozens of them. Cargo vessels, destroyers, transport ships, all arranged in a formation that suggested not just military presence, but absolute naval dominance. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, had contested these waters with everything it had. Clearly it had lost. But it was one ship in particular that Miller pointed to, a strange, ungainly vessel that looked like it had been assembled from concrete blocks. "See that one?" Miller asked, waiting for Takahashi to translate. "The big gray one? That's the USS Quartz. You know what that ship does?" Hiroshi shook his head. Perhaps it was a secret weapon, some new technology that had turned the tide. Perhaps... "It makes ice cream," Miller said, and then laughed at Hiroshi's expression. I know. It sounds insane. But that's what it is. A floating ice cream factory. Produces 10 gallons a minute. We built it out of concrete because we needed the steel for real warships. That's how much material we have. We can waste concrete on desert ships." Takahashi translated, his voice carefully neutral. But Hiroshi caught the flicker of something in the young man's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or vindication. Takahashi's family had probably faced discrimination in America, had probably been interned because of their Japanese blood, and yet here he was, wearing an American uniform, translating for an American sergeant who wanted to show a captured Japanese officer an ice cream ship. 10 gallons a minute, Miller continued. That's 14,000 gallons a day. We've got sailors whose entire job is making sure the troops get ice cream in the middle of a war in the Pacific. Do you understand what that means? Hiroshi understood. God help him, he understood completely. It meant that while Japanese soldiers were eating grass, while they were boiling bark and calling it soup, while officers were conducting meetings about how to extract maximum nutrition from insects, the Americans were producing frozen desserts. It meant that the disparity between the two nations was not merely a matter of tactics or strategy or even courage. It meant that Japan had entered a contest so fundamentally mismatched that no amount of Bushido spirit or willingness to die could possibly bridge the gap. It meant the war was over, had perhaps been over from the beginning, and every death since, every Japanese soldier who had starved on some forgotten island, every kamikaze pilot who had flown into a ship, every civilian who would burn in the coming firestorms was merely the universe's way of working through the mathematics of an equation that had already been solved. Miller studied his face. You get it now, don't you? Hiroshi nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Come on, Miller said, his voice softer. Let's get you some. The ice cream was vanilla. Simple, unadorned vanilla served in a small paper cup that had been manufactured specifically for this purpose, printed with the words U.S. Navy in neat blue letters. Miller handed it to him with a wooden spoon, the kind of gesture that might have accompanied a gift between friends. Hiroshi looked at it for a long moment. The ice cream was already beginning to melt in the tropical heat, white rivulets running down the sides of the cup. He had never tasted ice cream before. In Japan, such luxuries had been beyond the reach of anyone but the wealthiest families, even before the war. Now, as a prisoner, he was being offered something his own country could never have provided him, He took a bite. It was cold. Shockingly cold. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, a flavor so rich and pure that it seemed to belong to a different plane of existence. Cream, sugar, vanilla. Simple ingredients transformed through industrial processes that required electricity and refrigeration and supply chains and all the invisible infrastructure of a nation that had never questioned whether it could afford such things. Tears ran down his face, mixing with the melting ice cream. He couldn't stop them. Miller and Takahashi looked away politely, understanding that something was breaking inside this young officer, something that needed to break. "We didn't start this war," Miller said quietly after a respectful pause. "But we're going to finish it. And when we do, when Japan surrenders, and it will, Lieutenant, it absolutely will, we're not going to destroy your country. We're going to rebuild it. We're going to feed your people. Because that's what we do. That's who we are." Takahashi translated, his voice thick with emotion. Hiroshi believed him. How could he not? The evidence was literally melting in his hands. In the weeks that followed, Hiroshi began to piece together the full scope of the disparity. He learned that the USS Quartz was not unique. There were other ice cream barges, other floating factories dedicated to morale rather than warfare. He learned that American soldiers received cigarettes, candy, magazines, letters from home delivered with such regularity that mail call was a daily occurrence rather than a miraculous rarity. He met other prisoners who told similar stories of disillusionment. A naval aviator who had been captured after his fighter was shot down described watching American carrier groups operate with such casual efficiency that it seemed choreographed. A sergeant from the Philippines talked about American field kitchens that served 3 hot meals a day, 3, while his own unit had considered itself lucky to receive a handful of rice every 48 hours. But it was the statistics that truly hammered home the reality. Takahashi, perhaps taking pity on these defeated men, shared numbers that no one in Japan would have believed. The United States produced more steel in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. American shipyards were launching a new vessel every single day. The Ford Motor Company alone manufactured more military equipment than the entire nation of Italy. While Japan's economy had been squeezed and rationed and stripped to the bone, America had simultaneously fought a two-front war, maintained civilian prosperity, and still had enough excess capacity to build ice cream ships. "How?" Hiroshi asked one evening, sitting with a small group of prisoners and Takahashi, who had become something of an unofficial liaison. "How did we not know?" Takahashi considered the question carefully. "Your leaders knew," he said finally. "Admiral Yamamoto knew. He studied at Harvard. He saw American factories. He warned that Japan could fight for 6 months, maybe a year. But after that, American industry would bury you. They didn't listen. Or maybe they listened and didn't care. Maybe they thought spirit would overcome steel." "And does it?" Hiroshi asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Takahashi said simply. "It doesn't. Spirit without resources is just another way of saying noble suicide. Your leaders sent you to die beautifully. America sent its soldiers to win efficiently. That's the difference." August 15th, 1945. The prisoners were assembled in the compound yard. A radio had been set up, and through its speakers came a voice that many of the prisoners recognized, though they could barely comprehend the words. Emperor Hirohito, speaking in the archaic court Japanese that most common soldiers found nearly incomprehensible, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few smiled with relief so profound it seemed to transform their faces. Hiroshi felt nothing, or rather he felt everything at once, a chaos of emotion that canceled itself into numbness. Miller found him afterward, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing. "It's done," the sergeant said unnecessarily. "You're going home eventually. Might take a while to process everyone, but you'll go home." "Home?" Hiroshi repeated. The word felt strange in his mouth. Home to what? A Japan that had been firebombed into submission? A family that might not have survived? An empire that no longer existed? "What did you do?" he asked Miller suddenly. "Before the war. What was your job?" Miller looked surprised by the question. "I sold insurance, auto insurance, mostly. Boring stuff." "Insurance?" Hiroshi said, and started to laugh, a sound without humor. "You sold insurance, and they made you a soldier, and you won." "Well, me and about 16 million other Americans," Miller said. "That's the thing, Lieutenant. We didn't need to be soldiers. We were insurance salesmen and farmers and factory workers and teachers. We just became soldiers. And when the war's over, we'll become those things again. That's America. We're good at becoming whatever we need to be." Hiroshi thought about this. In Japan, the military had been a permanent caste, a hereditary tradition. Men trained their entire lives for war, and they had been defeated by insurance salesmen who learned to fight between shifts at the factory. "The ice cream," he said. "I think about it every day. That ship." "Yeah," Miller said. "I figured you might. It wasn't just about ice cream." "No," Miller agreed. "It wasn't. It was about the casual waste of resources on luxuries. It was about a nation so confident in its victory that it could dedicate an entire vessel to morale rather than combat. It was about the gulf between a country fighting for survival and a country fighting because it had been attacked but never truly threatened. It was about steel and oil and food and all the mundane, unglamorous logistics that won wars while generals argued about honor and strategy. It was about recognizing that you had lost before the first shot was fired and simply not knowing it yet. In the years after the war, Hiroshi Tanaka returned to a Japan that bore little resemblance to the empire he had served. The cities were rubble. The people were starving. The emperor was not a god, but a mortal man in a suit, reading speeches written by American occupation officers. And yet strange things happened. The Americans did not torture or execute the prisoners as promised. They did not rape and pillage as the propaganda had predicted. Instead, they rebuilt. They brought food, mountains of food, more food than Hiroshi had ever seen even before the war. They brought medicine. They brought engineers and construction equipment and plans for a new Japan, a democratic Japan, a Japan that would never again starve its soldiers while dreaming of conquest. Hiroshi got a job with an American trading company, translating documents and facilitating business deals. He married. He had children. He watched as Japan transformed from devastated enemy to trusted ally, as Japanese engineers began producing electronics and automobiles that Americans bought eagerly, as the cycle of destruction and reconstruction completed itself in ways that would have seemed impossible in August of 1945. But sometimes on hot summer days, he would see his children eating ice cream, something that had become commonplace in post-war Japan, a treat available to anyone with pocket change. And he would remember the USS Quartz. He would remember Sergeant Miller and the taste of vanilla, and the moment his entire worldview had shattered like glass. He never told his children this story. How could he explain it? How could he make them understand what it meant to discover that everything you had been told was a lie, that every sacrifice had been for nothing, that the nation you were willing to die for had sent you into battle against an enemy so vastly superior that the war's outcome had never been in doubt? Instead, he simply watched them laugh and enjoy their ice cream, and he thought, this is victory. Not the military victory America won, but the human victory we all won when the killing finally stopped. When insurance salesmen could go back to selling insurance, when children could eat ice cream without knowing it had once been a weapon of psychological warfare. In 2003, Hiroshi Tanaka died at the age of 81 in a hospital in Tokyo, equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1945. His grandson, clearing out his apartment, found among his possessions a small wooden spoon, the kind that might have been used to eat ice cream, worn smooth by decades of handling. The grandson, who had never known war, who had grown up in a Japan of bullet trains and economic miracles, who ate at McDonald's and watched American movies and thought of the United States as an ally rather than an enemy, looked at this spoon with puzzlement. Why would his grandfather keep such a thing? What could possibly be significant about a piece of disposable cutlery? He threw it away. But the story, though Hiroshi never told it directly, survived. It survived in fragments in the way Hiroshi insisted his children never waste food, in his strange relationship with American culture, simultaneously grateful and resentful, admiring and melancholic. It survived in the way he would sometimes pause when seeing military parades or political speeches about national pride, as if remembering something he could never quite articulate. And in its own way, the story became part of the larger narrative of the war, one of thousands of small moments of recognition when soldiers on both sides realized the true nature of the conflict they were engaged in. The American sailors who found Japanese soldiers with stomachs full of grass. The Marines who captured supply depots that contained nothing but empty crates and wishful thinking. The pilots who flew over Japanese industry and saw factories that looked more like workshops than the massive complexes they were used to bombing in Germany. All of them in their own way had their ice cream moment, that instant when the propaganda fell away and reality revealed itself in all its harsh mathematics. The USS Quartz was decommissioned after the war, broken up for scrap. The concrete was probably used in some mundane construction project, perhaps a bridge or a building foundation, its unusual origin story forgotten. No monument was erected to this strange vessel. No museum preserved its memory. It exists now only in scattered historical records and in stories like this one, testimony to a time when America's industrial might was so overwhelming that it could afford to be frivolous even in the midst of total war. But for Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka and the thousands of Japanese prisoners who encountered similar evidence of American abundance, the ice cream ship remained the perfect symbol of their defeat. Not because it killed them. It saved them, fed them, gave them a reason to hope for survival. But because it revealed with crystalline clarity the futility of everything they had endured. All the death, all the starvation, all the suicidal courage, all the talk of Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit. None of it mattered. None of it could bridge the gap between a nation that could build ice cream ships and a nation that couldn't feed its soldiers rice. That was the taste of defeat. Not bitter as one might expect. Not ash and blood and humiliation. Sweet. Impossibly sweet. Cold vanilla ice cream on a hot August day. The flavor of abundance, the taste of a war that had ended before it began, finally catching up to the men who had been too brave or too foolish or too loyal to understand what they were fighting against, the taste of reality, after years of lies, the taste of survival after months of starvation, the taste of the future arriving in a small paper cup marked U.S. Navy, carried by an insurance salesman from Ohio who had become a soldier just long enough to win a war, and who would soon return to his previous life, as if the whole bloody affair had been nothing more than an unfortunate interruption. That was America's secret weapon, Hiroshi understood too late, not superior tactics or technology or courage. Simply this. The ability to fight a total war without becoming a warrior culture, to mobilize completely without militarizing society, to win and then go home and forget about winning because there were insurance policies to sell, and lives to live, and ice cream to eat on lazy Sunday afternoons. Japan had transformed itself into a sword. America had remained a factory, and in the end, the factory had simply manufactured more swords than Japan possessed, along with tanks and planes and ships and ice cream and everything else, and won the war as casually as it did everything else, efficiently, abundantly, without needing to pretend that deprivation was virtue or that suicide was strategy. The USS Quartz made 10 gallons of ice cream per minute, That was all anyone needed to know about how the war would end. That was the taste of defeat.